is to basically rethink how we think about sustainability. A lot of environmental and conservation and other notions of sustainability have kind of tend to perpetuate power dynamics. They tend to extract environmental concerns from other social justice issues. And so critical sustainability literacies, the idea is to find other ways to think about these things, to find alternatives in ways that are more holistic and obviously that take into account the power structures that we have in our society, shaped by our particular colonial, apartheid, and other histories. So one of the outcomes of this grant that CriSHET hosts every year is a theory workshop. Last year we looked at, what was it,
theoretical, speculative.
There we go. Which is really great. And then this year's one is on policy analysis, and I believe Luan will be speaking about critical discourse analysis as policy analysis, but he will explain more. For any of you who don't know, this is Luan Staphorst. He is a researcher at CriSHET. He's busy doing a PhD at Oxford in literary studies. Yeah, but he has a wide range of expertise. So yeah, let me hand over to you, Luan.
Thanks.
Exit stage 5.
Yes, so as Ginny mentioned, this is kind of the second workshop, and as will become clear, those of you who were in the previous workshop, there are some overlaps under the middle point, but it's not something that you would have had to be in to understand the grasp. So it kind of speaks towards each other, but it's still independent. So critical policy analysis or policy analysis with a critical lens. First ask, when last have any of you written a piece of policy? Written, yeah. Anyone?
Last or
when last? When last?
Yeah.
Well, have any of you ever written a piece of policy?
No.
I haven't either. Have any of you read a piece of policy?
Yeah.
When last?
Very recently.
Where? What portion?
Ethical clearance.
Ethical clearance, yeah. Because that's one I think that most of us at some point might come across, particularly if you do anything that is kind of practical in any sense. Although I've never read an ethical thing throughout because I haven't done that. But I know bits and pieces. But Jenny, what have you read?
I recently read a few things. The one I go back to quite often is the postdoctoral fellow and research fellowship policy.
Yeah.
And then I've also read I'm recently reading the plagiarism policy.
Okay, interesting. Anyone else can remember any policy that they perhaps?
No, that's okay.
Okay, yeah. Wow, this morning. You're the most recent. Well, I'm glad that we got these kind of two different responses. We have an institutional response from Fortune and Jenny, and then we had more of a kind of national response. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that policy are very broad documents, but they can also be very specific documents. So, I mean, even this room would have a policy. Even if it's an unspoken policy, there would be a policy around booking it out and arranging chairs and all of these different things. So policies are on different levels, and they have different levels of articulation as well, and influence. But at the end of the day, there are documents, and documents can be read and critiqued, written and rewritten. So just keep that in mind. The policy analysis is just kind of reading of policies, and usually we think about policies as very broad things that we are talking about today mostly, but that they find concrete expression like student guidance. So that's also a policy document. So different level. So when we talk about policy analysis, did any of you do politics or governmental sciences and undergrad perhaps? You did. Okay. So did you do any policy analysis?
We did a lot of policy analysis and political science.
And what type of policy documents did you, can you remember? Was it political parties, government?
It was government, political parties, international laws, and stuff like that. Mostly government related, political party related.
And was it mostly analysis, or were you also requested to write policy or not? Kind of as an exercise?
Well, it was basically just analysis. We were just basically just taught these policies.
Now, that's good that you can share that, because that's what most people do. Mostly when we think about policy analysis, it's just the idea of analyzing a document. But policy analysis studies over the past few years has shifted towards emphasizing, okay, but what is the creation of policy? Which is kind of, you can't go without that. You can't say a policy up to shit, but you can't write something new, right? So it goes hand in hand. It's both of policy, but also for policy. And what we'll get to later on in the workshop is doing both. I'm going to give you something, I'm going to want you to analyze it and then to suggest something new. Because they go hand in hand. And again, it's very easy, or it's easier, and I won't say it's very easy, but it's easier to critique always versus kind of coming up with something new that doesn't have kind of power differentials and new forms of oppression and effects. Almost impossible. But perhaps we can solve that today. So this is something we discussed in the last workshop as well, which is kind of the bedrock of a lot what we do in CriSHET. But I think it's very often assumed, but not said as such. So we use the word critical, and it has different meanings in different contexts. So I'd like to ask, if just off the bat, what do you associate with the word critical when you just hear the word? What comes to mind? What do you think about? Anyone? Radical, interesting.
Yeah,
Not impartial.
Sorry?
Not impartial.
Not impartial. Okay, so kind of having a standpoint.
Yeah, the stance.
There's a stance. Yes. Okay.
Some kind of a deep interrogation.
Deep interrogation. I like that as well. Yeah. Good.
Oh, we have it on there. I can just read it.
Yeah, this is something we have to talk about perhaps. I don't know, colleagues online. We should open the chat, but perhaps I don't know if when you put up your hand on the thing that
you should be able to see it.
You'll be able to see it. Okay.
Yeah. Sonia, did you have a comment in the chat? Now I'm starting to open the chat.
Yeah, just
You
when
wanna speak?
when I hear critical, I think of politics and power.
Politics and power. Politics and power, deep investigation, radical, taking a stance. Any other ideas? Just off the bat, no wrong, just what you associate with, what you think of. Anything else? Okay. Those are good things to associate with critical, because critical, the word, Michaela. Critical means challenging the norms. Thanks, Michaela. Yeah, exactly. Challenging the norms as well. Because norms are in themselves, in many ways, just the phenomena of power. They are the ways in which society or parts of society function. And that's because people have come together and kind of lived their life in that way, and people have made laws. So norms are very much the embodiment of sets or standards of things, and critique or criticality is to challenge that. But it's also important to remember that outside of our space, the word critical could just have a lot of other negative connotations. If you think about being in a relationship with someone, someone says, "Oh, you're being overly critical," right? Yeah, that just means, oh, you're actually being negative. Yes, sir. Now, I mean, doing a deep investigation of something can also be a negative thing, but it can lead to something positive. So the general, what people often use the word criticism or critical, they don't use it in the sense that we use it. We use it in the academy or in critical theory. And our kind of baseline for a lot of these ideas is Karl Marx. Most of you would know kind of Communist Manifesto, a lot of ideas in critique and critical theory. But he has this fantastic quote. This is a quote that I know Prof always loves to put in. If ever someone asks, what do you mean by critique? He means this. And I do think it is a quite nice summary. By criticism, I am referring to ruthless criticism of all that exists. Ruthless both in the sense of not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of conflict with powers that be. So that sense of kind of being open to anything, and also being open to what you might not even think might be the result. And that's an important part as well. So what Fortune just mentioned about standpoint, that's an important dimension often today in critique. People often are very clear about their stance and they want to. But that can be good, but it can also be inhibiting.
I see the sections.
No,
Hi, Elsie.
Hi, Elsie. Welcome.
The one is the one I must pop in the chat.
Oh,
Yes, then we'll be able to see
I see.
if it was
Okay, let me just see, where is the chat?
they want to talk.
On the web?
So above the list of colleagues who joined.
See about Elsie. Between Elsie and Michel in this chat. Oh,
Oh, I had to open the thing.
Yes.
Okay.
well, I've opened it now on my side also, so I can also read.
Okay, then it's fine. I've just opened it, but yeah, thanks. Okay. Because when it's open, I can't see the PowerPoint. But it's not a major difference, Matt. Yeah, so that position of standpoint theory with standpoint criticism, standpoint theory is an important one, particularly if those particular viewpoints have not historically been dominant or present, right? But if you are too firm in your standpoint theory, you will probably, in that standpoint, is your conclusion very new, rather than seeing where the critique sends you. So that emphasis on not being afraid of what the critique shows you, rather than what you yourself want the critique to be. I mean, that's often what happens. Sometimes there's a fantastic thing Jenny would know this in literary studies. There's been a major change in literary studies called post-critique. And the reason for this post-critique is that often someone picks up a novel and they have a theory. And the theory says the environment is another, and the environment is othered by people in the novel. Then the person goes and writes 8 pages on this theory about how yes, I said that it's not always negative, and I said that negative can be productive. Yes, thanks for that. Oh, no. So now you have a 10-page article, right? And the first 8 pages of the article is just a summary of all the theory, what all the other smart people said. And then you go pick a passage from the novel, and that says, oh, that's also the case. But you didn't look at all other 99,000 pages words in the novel. And you also didn't pick things that might have contradicted you. And you also didn't perhaps even look at how the novel might further theory. So sometimes criticalness in whatever field becomes stunted, it's a fixed thing. And you say, oh, this is how the world is, because this smart person said so, usually a person in the north. And you take what they said, and you say, oh, look, this is just another example of what they said is right. And that doesn't really, it might be beneficial in some ways, but in many ways it can also stunt our thinking. Because all that we then do is we just keep on applying what someone else said, rather than even questioning that critical apparatus.
Can I ask a question? So in like so you're saying criticism, but so critical theory or critical studies versus critical thinking. Like how people in the university talk about critical thinking, and that doesn't even seem to me critical studies, in my understanding, has a sort of focus on power and power structures. Are you getting there? Whereas critical thinking seems to be more about like not taking stuff for granted.
Yes.
And so the overlap, there's also a distinction.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're getting to that. So just as a kind of baseline, when people say critical, people usually need one of two things. They either mean critique, like we're using it, or just criticism, like the purely negative. I'm just critical of you. I don't like you. Like your hair, I don't like you're too short, tall, or whatever. That's just criticism. But critique in relation to criticality is what we get to now, and what Jenny mentioned, is very much firmly in relation to power. So if you read Marx and you read a lot of proto-social theorists or proto-critical theorists from the late 19th, early 20th century, you often find implicit in their writing that it's about power. But it's only really with the work of Michel Foucault, on the one hand, in kind of broad humanities, and Norman Fairclough in linguistics, that's very specific to critical discourse analysis, that you then find this very clear articulation, that the critical, at least in the academic sense, in theoretical sense, is linked to the identification and the challenging and the engagement with power differentials, different forms of power. Right. So you still have people in the academy who say, I do a critical analysis of a novel or a critical analysis of an artwork. And that kind of art criticism is not the same as critical theory. And again, the emphasis on critique as this embodiment of an engagement with power only really comes quite articulate, quite firm in the work of people like Foucault, people like Fairclough. But again, that doesn't mean that prior to their work, it wasn't the case. It was just not articulated as such. Okay. Now, are any of you familiar with Foucault's work? What context have you?
The history of sexuality.
Yeah, history of sexuality. That's one of his 3-4 volume works.
Yes.
Yeah. What was your takeaway from the history of sexuality? What did you find reading that work?
Like Victorian influences of how we shape our sexuality and how power plays a huge role in how we think about even how we pursue pleasure and what we find pleasurable, and how power takes our tastes, basically, when we think about pleasure.
Yeah.
Because he does a whole analysis of the Victorian era, what women were exposed to, how the ideas they formed about themselves, and how those trickled down even in their pursuit of eroticism, if I can put it in that way.
Thank you for that. Anyone else with any of these texts? Perhaps with that, someone else? Yes?
With regards to how in sociology they say violence decreases with modernity. So what Foucault says, he says that it's not that violence decreases when our society is being modern, it's just that the state kind of adopts a way of just surveilling everyone. And that is also violence. So I use his work in terms of that, in trying to trace the traditional way that sociology studies violence and then how they can study violence now. So it's just a few characters. What he says, yeah.
No, but there's already something important which I'll get you a portion about. Any other comments, perhaps, in the chat or online? Anyone?
Maybe people online have some comments, but so yeah, like surveillance, that panopticon, that for me, the thing that stands out most in my head about Foucault, we always come back to that panopticon. And it's very interesting. That whole argument is how a shift of how power functions from enforcing it through violence, like we say, to shifting it to surveillance. Where we are now with social media and stuff, I don't even know. But the other thing that I found interesting, and I think this was when I was reading part of history of sexuality, was, and I could, this was a while ago, and I could have misunderstood him, but what he seemed to be suggesting was that even things we think are subversive, what is considered subversive and alternative is in fact shaped by power itself. So you almost take it to the next level of not just identify power, that's the power, but also the ways in which we relate to that. They are habit. It's much more entangled than we think. It's basically, I can't articulate very well, but
no, but yes. In this, I saw Michaela had a comment, but I can't.
let me find it now. She said she's only engaged with Foucault outside of its context. People have used its quotes to support their own critique.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Michaela, that's an excellent point. That's what I mentioned earlier in relation to the problem with a lot of what happens in critique is that people just use it to they already have the conclusion and they pick and nitpick the authors and the data that supports that conclusion. Now, I'm not saying that we all don't do that. I think to a certain extent that's even a bias that we might have, even what we write about. Sometimes, what you don't write about says something as well about. So this is what Jenny mentioned. I think we're all engaged in these forms of power. But it's also quite important to remember it's not a fixed thing. It's not like off of the head of the Marie Antoinette and everything is perfect. No, when they realized that didn't really lead to much else. There were all of these counter-revolutions because they discovered, well, everyone has some power. And it depends on how we enact. Which comes back into policies. And policies, again, we tend to think about as this big thing that happened there at a government level, at a provincial level. But policies are in various ways, and policies are also things that don't really mean anything unless people make so, right? The policies are things that only get life. But in many ways, policies are the things that we all do, rather than the words on the page. So that's important as well. Now, what's kind of simmering underneath what the comments we just heard is that, besides Michel, not to say Michaela's comment is irrelevant, but to say that just in the comments that came from the room now was a strong historicization element, particularly to Foucault's book. So if we take Foucault as a kind of way of thinking about critical discourse analysis, which there is people do Foucauldian CDA, there's a strong element, okay, always on power, right? But the way in which you approach it is through historicization. So thinking about the sexuality element, you say, let's go to the Victorian era. Let's go to the pre-modern era, to the 1500s. Let's go to the medieval era. Where? And we try and see to what extent that way of thinking has influenced the present. And that influence can also be a counter influence, as Jenny mentioned, that you react to things, right? So you might think you're radical, but you're just still in the confines of that discourse because you're defining yourself in contrast to it. So you're still beholden to it, right? So that's a very important dimension of one important approach to CDA, because if you Google CDA, as many web pages as you'll find, there'll be as many approaches to CDA. The CDA is one of those words that in many ways does not denote any one specific thing outside of a consciousness of power. So you can kind of mold and shape your own approach to CDA based on what type of study you're doing, but also based on who you find interesting. So if you're a Foucauldian person, that will naturally speak to you. Like I love historicization of research. So a lot of my work, which has taken on some CDA elements, that's very much the historical dimension to it, right? But someone else is not that fascinated by that, so they do something else. And another example is Fairclough. I never know how to pronounce it. Fairclough, that's the one I've heard most. Do anyone know that name? In what context?
Oh, so I use critical discourse analysis as my methodology.
Okay, so you know a bit more about him as well.
Yes.
So how do you use him in your methodology?
So basically, I use critical discourse analysis to explain how gender-based violence is explained in the media. The whole power behind discourse, power in discourse. So I use that as a methodology to kind of paint the picture of GBV and higher education institutions.
Okay, thank you for that. Anyone else have any interaction with Fairclough's model?
Heard the name.
You heard
Probably in relation to CDA, but I haven't done any studies.
Yes. Yeah, so Fairclough is one of those kind of, so Foucault didn't call his work CDA. But Foucault was at the same time and a bit before, and his works become a model for a type of CDA. But Fairclough is one of those people who was part of that first generation of people to call their work CDA, of which he is one of many. And the reason I have him here in relation to Foucault is that where Foucault is the much more historical dimension, Fairclough is much more kind of contemporary. So it's almost like a slice of society. And the types of comments is very much also in media studies. So he would be very interested in these kinds of spheres of society. So you'd have government as a sphere, you'd have the media sphere, you'd have the public sphere, and then the private sphere. And these different spheres, and you can ask different questions in relation to these different spheres. But there's not to say that he doesn't have an historical dimension to him, but that's not the primary driver, primary, let's say, poetics, not the primary structure of his approach. So he's more thinking about different spheres. And so between the two of them, I think you have a good idea of what CDA can do. But there's obviously millions of different ways in between and millions of ways outside of them, just as long as you have the emphasis on power. But between the two of them, I would say you have two a very solid ideas, approaches, possible approach to CDA. One that is very much historical, and one which is more almost thinking of different publics. That there's the media public, there's the governmental public, there's the private public, and how these different forms interact with each other. Now, besides Fairclough and, well, you go back rather, Foucault, has anyone else done any CDA or used methodologies that was called CDA, or been taught methodologies that were called CDA, or otherwise another way to engage with CDA? Anyone else?
Let's pick with the online people. Any online people have any run into CDA?
Hi,
Sonia, I know you.
Oh.
Yeah, Asi, please go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, hi. This is not even gonna, I don't know, maybe it's not gonna give much, but I think I did a module in English undergrad. We did critical discourse analysis. But to be quite honest, I don't remember the content, but I just remember doing CDA as a module.
Thanks for that. Did you do English linguistics? Was that the
Yes.
context? Yeah. I know I didn't do English linguistics here, but I do know that they do, that is a part of it. So thanks for that. Anyone else?
Hi. So
Hi,
I
Nadia.
actually might have missed the previous question, but I also did do a bit of critical discourse analysis in linguistics as well. And I think we actually might have used it, but I might be mistaken, in kind of a policy analysis where we looked at different language policies. Then we looked more at like specifically the word itself, so the language and the meanings of the word like on face value, and then also like on a deeper level, what does it mean, that kind of stuff. So a little bit more critical, I guess, but looking at language policies. Yeah, and then the CDA, just the general, the same way that Senior kind of explained. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Nadia. Yeah, so yes, Fortune.
I think I have a question to you and Jenny.
Yes.
Like, I'm trying to understand like CDA in literary studies context, because we do a lot of textual analysis, comparative literature. Yeah, I think I want to just understand that link, CDA in literary studies.
Yeah, I've seen it being used, but mostly by people who are not literary scholars. So my reading of it is you find linguists or people who did CDA in another context, and they think, okay, that's the methodology. And they often also have like a title, methodology. But literary studies don't have that really. Don't say, what is our method? We read. That's our method. You pick up the book and you read. You write the article with a certain methodology by the sense of you have your different theories in here. So literary studies never really taken up CDA as much. And the people who, that's my impression. Maybe Jenny has something else different. But my experience is that more you see people from outside come in who don't do literary studies, and then they kind of put it in there. But the assumptions often of the critical theories that are used in literary studies are nevertheless commensurate with CDA. So it could also be called that, a lot of the work, but it's not necessarily couched in that language, and it doesn't necessarily have all of these clear, oh, now I'm doing this, and then I'm going there. And it's very much more organic, mostly.
I think that's what I'm saying. It's like, I think there's a lot of things that critical discourse analysis does that literary scholars do.
And I've always done it. And I've
Yeah.
always done that.
But we wouldn't call it that. And we also, I think, do things that perhaps critical discourse analysis would focus on, like
Yes.
so more focus on form and like figurative language,
Yes, yes,
tone and things like that, which maybe wouldn't come out in
yes. And
the application of
yeah.
CDA in like linguistics. That's what I would.
Yeah.
But again.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there might be someone who does very innovative work, and you know, I think in a broad slice, but it's not, yeah. But many of the same assumptions, many of the same questions, but just the approach would be a bit different. So what Nadia mentioned is important that she did it in relation to linguistics and in the context of linguistics, because Fairclough is a linguist. And much of CDA work has been formulated within linguistics, And so there's a kind of a level of it that often is very much languaging, right? Looking at specific words, Nadia mentioned, looking at language policy, analyzing specific words, sentence structure, syntax, etc., which there's not necessarily form as in the poetics, as in the overall, but just very nitty, right? But that level is not always present. And the type of CDA that I will talk about today, which is kind of my own approach that I've developed in relation to our work and CUS, that form of CDA also doesn't necessarily look at the nitty-gritty of linguistics because we're not all linguists, but you could nevertheless include that on each level or each type of question. But the emphasis to remember that there are CDA people who are very, very pedantic because they come from a linguistics background. I mean, that's also mostly where it's been structured and formulated, but it's kind of traveled. It's one of those beautiful theories that have traveled to other contexts and other disciplines, and people use the general framing of power and critique and discourse, but they formulate it in their own way. So, in relation to our work in CUS, over the past, so we had the NRF project, which ran from 2020 to 2022, and now we have the CSL project, research project, and then we had another, what was that? NISCA.
Oh, no, it's
NHS. We had to
consider critical universities, but
yes, which is also a CUS project, but kind of a next step. And throughout that project, we wrote a lot of reports. A lot of it has been published. Some of it hasn't published. More kind of technical reports, but on critical university studies. And in that process, I started asking myself, okay, but how could I structure this and give it some sense of methodology? What type of questions could we ask that could link to studying the university in a kind of philosophical, broader, discursive level, but that's still understandable and digestible. And there were three questions that I kind of, three levels of questions that I came up with that guided my thinking. And I've just kind of translated those questions into the realm of policy. Right. So the first question is, from where and to where does the policy flow? So in essence, the question of who, right? And importantly also to whom. Because sometimes it's more often than not, the policy would either have one or the other, quite pertinent, quite plain. You can see the university must, Senate must, research chairs must. But then they don't say, okay, but to whom must they? Right? Who are they acting upon? On the other side of the coin, if you have student-centered policy, say, oh, the students must. And the student, and then, okay, but who's checking up on them? And who? So oftentimes there's always this, or not always, there's oftentimes this interaction between a who and a where and a whom, but they're not always articulated. So asking firstly yourself the question of who's at play here, who's part of this context, who has the power and who's being power to act and enact, and who's being acted upon, right? That kind of tension. That's the first question. The second question is, or questions, what are the constituent ideas? What are the underlying assumptions? What words are they using, or concepts that mobilize? And on the other side of also, what are they not saying, right? So if the first question is more who's at play, the second question is, how are they structuring their ideas that are at play? So you might say, okay, students in this university, good, okay, we now know who the actors are, but what are they basing that piece of policy on? What do you have to understand? What is the shared language, the shared conceptual frame? And very importantly, what is left out? What are they assuming you know, or assuming that you wouldn't know? Or vice versa. And then finally, which is usually the question most people are with policies inherently concerned with, but which is not necessarily as clear cut if you don't look at if you disregard the first two questions, is what are the intended effects? And I put intended in quotation marks, because there are a lot of unintended effects, right? Any policy has that. So this is the question people think is the important one of policy, if you are not critical. And even if you are critical, you might take this question for granted. But if you read or keep this question in mind, in the front of your mind, whilst having all these other two questions in the back of your mind, then you can do a bit more of critical analysis in relation to power and dynamics of who's at play, what's assumed, what isn't assumed, etc. Now, going to CUS, some of you might have seen this before a few times, I think. This comes from a chapter that Prof and I wrote, which is kind of the main thrust of this historical study of the university. So we did a study on the study of the university. And where does CUS slot in? Now, we did higher education studies, higher education transformation studies, and then CUS. But this is just to show you how these questions can result to you in your own mind and in your own analysis, how that can be used for comparative study and how to actually, on a piece of page, understand what are the dimensions of a certain field, of a certain policy, of a certain document, of a certain way of life, certain way of thinking. So if we take the first level, what I call the methodological question, that's the question of the who. Who does what, right? And to whom? The realm of action, in this. Whose action, who's enacting. The second level is the epistemological realm, the realm of knowing. So that's the concepts, the ideas, the assumptions, the epistemological plane. And then lastly, the ontological plane. Importantly, that one of effects and how are people's ontologies, how are their statuses, their values changed and perhaps changed or not changed by virtue of policy or whatever frame of reference it might be. So those three questions that I just went over with you, this is what I would call the methodological question, right? In relation to action, who has the power to act, who can act, on whom are they acting? Then you have an epistemological question, the assumptions, the concepts, the ideas, and what is not said, what concepts are not engaged with. And then finally, the ontological. What happened? What are we at the end of all of this? What do we have? If we're radical and we're like some people like Sharon Stein, we destroy the university. If we're like Premesh Lalu, we say, no, that's also Eurocentric to destroy, to create, more transformative. Or we can be very conservative and say, no, we're all perfect. There's nothing to be done. So what are these ontological, what type of effects at the very end do we have? And in relation to policy analysis at university, what type of university do we have after enacting this policy? After writing, drafting, what does the university look like? What does it stand for? The end for. So, do a bit of an exercise with you. You go, well, not to do the exercise that you have to do, but exercise that I have done, we have done with CUS. So I'm going to show you where it leads to. But we're still going to do exercise as it goes along. So this is, we did an analysis of the NRF strategy 2025. And even though it's now 2025, so they actually have a new document, most of these things are exactly the same. Particularly this key section is on their values and their ideas and blah. So there's two slides. First slide is what was from the preamble to the section of the policy. And then the second slide is more in-depth but it's one longer piece, and I've taken 2 paragraphs. So firstly, just take the time to read through this paragraph on your own. Everyone read through it? Just, are there any impressions? There doesn't have to be, but does anyone have any impressions after reading this? Anything that jumps out for you that's strange or you interesting or beautiful, ugly, anything? Doesn't have to be, but perhaps they are.
I find it interesting that they name a bunch of factors, or what do they call them? Or critical success factors that are often seen as like actually with tensions, and then they acknowledge none of the tensions at all. It's like these are inseparable, interdependent, and coherent, and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Thanks, Jenny. That's an interesting, good point. Yeah. So again, it sounds very lovely, right? But where are the tensions? So that's an assumption, right? That's the kind of on an epistemological plane. What is the assumption is that there are no real tensions here, because if they were, they would have said so. So yeah. Any other impressions? Okay.
The assumption that they're already a success, these success factors.
Oh yes, well that's also an assumption, right? These are, by definition, success factors. That's a very important one, perhaps the most important one. I mean, who? Yeah, according to whom? You know, kind of. Who says? Yeah. Interesting what Michaela says. Critical in this is kind of critical as in important, as in we have to do it now. That's a very important thing. I haven't picked up on that. Thanks, Michaela. Yeah, so that's yeah, so kind of we have to do it now in the next 5 years, else we're going to die. Oh, yeah, probably the assumption. Or the NIF is going to be useless in 5 years. So, okay, critical as in urgent, as in important, but not critical as in changing power structures, or even necessarily negative, but just critical as in urgent. Now, we go into one of those factors. This is what they write, there's a whole section. And each of one of those factors, they have a little piece like this. This is the excellence part. Also, take some time to read through it. Any impressions on this one? That is a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, when I've read this a few times, it sometimes feels as if from paragraph 1 to 2, everything changes, and then it changes back, and then it doesn't. Yeah.
I mean, for me, what's interesting is they say excellence is generally understood as a comparative judgment of an endeavor rather than a substantive one, and then they kind of just go with that.
Yeah. Yes.
They don't go. Maybe that's like
a problem.
They sort of seem to point out that this is a hierarchical thing, and you think they're going to go somewhere with it, and then they sort of just seem to go with the general understanding.
Yes, yeah.
And then, so it's interesting that they put it out there. They don't really say this is how we are conceptualizing. They just say this is the general understanding, and they just kind of move on, which I think is what makes it confusing, partly. So they sort of say a bunch of things.
You just splash it on the page.
And then you're kind of not sure where they're standing, like their standpoint very clear. And then find at the end that this particularly important as the NRF is rightly expected to advance scientific excellence in the national sciences. So it's very much like this assertion of an uncritical assertion of we don't know what excellence is. We're gonna say a bunch of things, but also this is definitely the right thing to do. Okay. Bizarre.
Just Excel.
Just Excel.
Yeah.
Not Microsoft Excel, Excel.
So basically what it seems to be saying is they almost imply, just through the way in which they've juxtaposed these kind of things, is that we are expected to advance appearing better than other people within comparative judgment of education institutions. We don't have to be actually excellent, we just have to appear. I don't know. Very weird piece of text.
Thanks, Jenny. Any other comments, ideas, gestures?
We get just saying what being excellent as a bad is just daft.
Not just daft.
Especially when it is a comparative judgment described.
Thanks, Michaela. Any other ideas and comments? Okay. So, just to show you kind of this is what's coming to the fore. There's a word that people use, people who do CDA or just DA, discourse analysis, is the word coding. Now, personally, I hate that word because coding, it almost assumes it's. Recently, I was at a conference, and the conference was a literary studies conference, And there were people doing interesting stuff who were not literary scholars, who were doing from other fields. And one of these other fields were people who had a literary scholar working with a person who's computer science. And they worked with a massive collection of poetry, kind of standard anthology of poetry, Afrikaans poetry. And they put the collection through a machine, and they said, okay, which words appear most where? But what's nice about this collection is that there's 3 volumes. So volume 1 is mostly kind of the 1890s to the 1930s, 40s. Volume 2 is 1950 to 1980, and then the third is the most recent. So it's a good thing to kind of compare time, right? So what they then did is they said, okay, let's take the word God, and we look at how religious Afrikaans poetry is. So we see, if we typed in the word God, and we found, oh, in the first volume it appeared 20 times. The second volume it appeared 10 times. The third volume it only appeared twice. Oh, so here go. Religious poetry is getting less. But of course, so they've coded with the word God or the word belief. But of course, there are other ways to say that. You don't have to use that word. That's the problem. So coding is I'm a very bit, don't like it as much. But it can be beneficial even if your own mind is thinking something through. If you're doing a very much a qualitative analysis. For quantitative analysis, obviously, it has its own values and its own place. But what we're doing today, more qualitative analysis, coding can be a beneficial thing and it can be a hindrance. So in the hindrance, I think, is if you look only at it and you're stuck, you're kind of determined by the word. But if you have a more open idea of it, and like this, where I'm thinking more coding is almost like if you have a stick where you can put your hat on or your jacket, and you walk into a building and you can. Coat rack, yes, there's the word. You see, in Afrikaans, it's literally a kapstok, literally a hitting stick. And I'm thinking, no, a hat stick, a hitting stick, that's not English. No, English strikes again. A coat rack. So in this sense, if you think about those coding more as a coat rack, kind of to structure your own idea, that can be beneficial. So what I've done here is to kind of code those key sections from this document, that you can slot into the assumptions that are being made. So the methodological here, a major assumption is that we are always entangled with the global science community, which is correct. But the question is whether we should be beholden to that global science community, which they assume that we should be. In other words, we are these people working in a global science community, but should we have to necessarily work with the standards or the procedures set out by in those spheres? That's a methodological assumption. That's an interesting question, Neil. Neil asked a question about who the actual authors were. These documents are mostly authored by no one. It's kind of these floating documents. It's by an office, which, to be fair, we do as well. I mean, we as CriSHET have, CriSHET website. Who writes the website? Who writes a call for papers? Who writes, if there's a seminar, there's a blurb, who writes that? Those things can be analyzed and critiqued, but yes, it's written by someone, obviously, someone in the team, but your name isn't on that. And a lot of these policy documents are like that. One of the most iconic policy documents that we have in South African university history is the Gerwel Commission on Language Policy. Now, that was the Gerwel Commission document, and then there's the Sudeen Commission document. But those are the exceptions. Mostly it's just these floating documents that's written by some technical committee, and it has no one's name on it. No one can take responsibility for it, really. It's just there. But that in itself, Neil, is an important question to ask. Because also this assumption that it's just this authority, right? It's just this floating voice, disembodied voice that's speaking, and that this is just like the New Testament. It's just like new Ten Commandments, just is, because it's floating from the netherworld, the ether. So that's a methodological kind of coding. And epistemological coding is what Jenny mentioned as well. This comparative judgment. That's what excellence is. rather than it being a substantive one. So the assumption is that, and there's no critical engagement, there's nothing beyond that. And then what does this lead to? Hopefully what they believe it will lead to is this kind of national development, kind of, even that, what does that, I mean, what national for who, right? Well, so these assumptions, and you can kind of use this methodology to break down the text for you in relation to these different claims that are being made. Someone just read Michaela's out loud, please.
I just love how knowledge and science are put forward as separate components within a global system.
Yes, yes. So again, not assuming that they're separate, assuming that they're these things and they're not always, all the time, everywhere, always, that thing.
And for me, I wanted to say what I struggle with that definition around excellence is that the phenomenon of quality is not addressed. It's like you need to think of numbers, even though like you need to think of rating, but I don't hear the phenomenon of quality, like of
Yes.
when it comes to research and scholarship or being an academic. So for me, that is missing. They try hint at it, but you still brought back into these numbers that you have to think numbers. And for me, I'm more quality than thinking I need to accumulate.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you. That's an excellent point. Excellent point. Because I mean that's a perennial tension, right? In all things we do, there's a tension between the quantifiable and the quantity and quality, right? And quantical the word qualitative research versus what's the other word? Quantitative. That's the word. And quantitative word. Quantitative research versus qualitative research. And even there, that's an assumption that the two can be split, which in many contexts that holds. I mean, reading a novel, thinking up an idea in philosophy, studying a piece of language or history, that cannot necessarily be quantified. Quantified. Just like if you do mathematics, that is quantifiable. The numbers and statistics. So yes, it does hold in some contexts, but in other ways it's more blurred. And I think in relation to quality, as Portia mentioned, is not here. In questions of performance, of impact, a lot of those things are not easily quantifiable, but people nevertheless jump towards that. So how many publications do you have? Okay, perhaps you have hundreds, but are they good quality articles? Do they make any new contributions? Where are they published? Are they published in journals that are reputable, or are they just in, predatory journals that you pay for money and you have a journal article? So these are questions to ask. Any other comments on this? Just impressions, or does this kind of make sense to you as one approach, or as one approach of CDA? Does this kind of make sense? Yes or no? Tell me if I'm stupid. This is my approach. You can say no, that's absolute shit, absolute cock. Don't do that. You can say that, because ultimately, right, we all can shape our own very specific research questions, and that's an important thing to keep in mind as well, which I haven't articulated clearly in reading up to this moment. That CDA, if you want to call your research CDA, you can very much tailor your methodology in relation to your research question, as long as, if you want to call it CDA, you keep this emphasis on power and how that has an influence, right? So here we very much see this acquiescence almost to global power. We see an acquiescence to a global scientific norm, which can be fine if that's what you want. But if you want to be more critical like we do, then we can say, okay, hold on. We also want to decolonize. We also want to Africanize. We also want to think about South-South connections. But all that we're seeing here is we're just looking at the North. We're looking at the imperial center. But if that's your worldview, then there's no problem with that. But if you want to have a different worldview or have a different vantage point, then you can do these kinds of analysis. So from that, these are some of the conclusions, but which are conclusions that we've already discussed, right? An important one, which Jenny mentioned at the very beginning, how this excellence notion is not, which is the value of the NRF, is not at all tied into any of the other values. And some of these things that we've mentioned could actually be addressed. Some of the other values are quite good, like impact. If you were to think in excellence in relation to impact, right, there's something you could say that's productive tension to sit with and to think through. Okay, if we were to really take impact serious, what type of impact? Are we looking at how many times an article has been cited? Okay, that's one form of impact. Are we looking at how many times that the author of that article has been invited to present at conference? That's another form of impact. Are we looking at how many more people as a result of that policy have access to education? That's another form of impact. So impact and also, it's also contentious. But just to think these things in relation to each other. The more obvious one of global university wanting to be excellent in relation to this global standard versus the NIS also emphasis on national development. Like that's a massive tension. In the first paragraph, it's a global thing, and the third paragraph is a national thing. Have you thought this through, people? But I think as clear to all of us, they haven't really. And to get to Neil's point, I wouldn't be surprised if you had 3 different people writing 3 different paragraphs, or 3 people writing 3 different versions, and each one just updates and revises, and they don't even talk to each other. That happens as well. So that's another important thing to think about as well, to keep it in the back of your head as well, to be kind of humble in critical analysis. Because sometimes we assume there's a big bad wolf sitting at the back of all of this. Sometimes they are, but sometimes it's also just happenstance. Like the fact that you have different writers writing this document, and they just kind of don't think, and then the second person doesn't think critical about the first person, and that they forget to argue. You know, there's a lot of humanness as well, and human errors that comes into these documents. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be critical in the sense that we shouldn't say what the effects are. Or I'm saying more is, don't say, oh, the NRF is horrible, and the NRF is stupid, and the NRF, you know, that's what I'm saying. Don't say that. That's not necessarily a good. To critique the document, critique the policy, critique the argument. But you remember that a lot of these things come to the fore by people who weren't necessarily critical. Because that's not their job, right? Or they didn't have enough time to do. We think about us, you know, a lot of the things that falls into CriSHET and ETP space, that's much more, we shoulder much heavier burden than we actually have the capacity for. But we do, just means that we have to do quicker, earlier, whatever. So to be humble in critical analysis, I think is also important. Unless you work with one person, unless you're critiquing one person's idea, and you can say, okay, that person's horrible. The moment it comes from these institutional things, remember that institutions are slow, terrible beasts. And they are everywhere and nowhere. Like Senate exists everywhere. We all hear the product of Senate. Where is the Senate? Senate people are not people who are employed by the university. So you have, council, I'm not saying council. The point is, there's a lot of these powers and things that happen, and it just happens. And then we can be very critical, which is good, but don't then overreach and say, oh, these people are stupid or ignorant, whatever. You don't know what went into this. Now, the next section, could I just ask any questions or comments at this point? We're kind of now moving to a second part of thinking policy analysis and policy. So is there any comments or questions or critiques of me, of this, of anything else up to this point before we shift gears?
Just a small point. Perhaps we should not just look at them and think, it's just a human error, and then this is a whole entire institution, and you're supposed to have your ducks on the row. I mean, there's systems in place. There's power dynamics where one reports to the other. So
Yes.
you're just going to let it be and not critically.
Yeah, no, that's not all what I'm. That's not all what I'm saying. So well, it can be human error because very important thing you just mentioned, supervisors. Remember that many supervisors of departments are not experts in those departments. Sometimes they become a supervisor precisely because they're not an expert. So I don't know if any of this is now very off topic, but have any of you heard of the Peter principle? The Peter principle. The idea is that people get, if you want to in a career, in a job, you are appointed to that job because you have a certain skill. You can write well, so you're appointed as a writer. You research well, so you're researching. You speak well, so you're the MC. Okay, all fine and good. But now that you're a writer or researcher or an MC or a lecturer or whatever, you are good in that job. So then we appoint you. Oh, now you have to oversee a department of writing. Okay, that's still okay because you're still a good writer. So you can still perhaps give critique of other people's writing and all the rest. But then you become suddenly, because you're good in that job, you become appointed the head of a division. And then there aren't just writers, there might be engineers, and there might be cleaning staff, and there might be this, and there might be that, which you have no qualification in, no knowledge in. So oftentimes what happens in organizations, you are promoted on the basis of a skill that you have in a job, but the next job that you're promoted into does not necessarily need that skill. So people are promoted to the level of their own incompetence. That's the Peter principle. And that's also a human thing, because how else do you judge? You see someone who's good in their job, you think, okay, that means they'll be good in the next job. Well, sometimes yes, but not always the case, because it doesn't mean that the skills are transferable. So what I want to get to is, you might have the writer who wrote this, and they made the human error. Now you say, oh, but the supervisor. Well, who's to say that the supervisor is a critical scholar themselves? Yes. So in other words, yes, I'm with you. In the ideal world, that would be the case. In the ideal world, but we don't live in the ideal world. We live in a world where people make mistakes, people are not. So it's more reckoning with that. But again, that is not me. That is not me. That you shouldn't critique. Or that it also doesn't mean that if you then see there are these gaps in an institution, which there should be this kind of responsibility, responsiveness, and accountability, that if it isn't there, that it needs to be implemented. So yes, so again, if it's not ideal, try to make it ideal. So, any other comments or suggestions? Okay, so what we're moving on to now, those of you who were in last year's workshop would remember this section. It's a short section from last year's workshop, which is on concept creation. Now, the whole session last year was actually on concept creation, so this is a broad topic. But I've just taken one small slice and one specific example, so to help us through thinking policy writing. Because at the bedrock of policy writing is still an idea, concept, a something like NRS excellence, right? That's part of what they're arguing for is excellence. So you often find that a policy has something at the base of it, GBV, for example, or employment equity, or excellence, or engagement, or whatever. And so thinking through writing a policy or critiquing a policy and then offering an alternative is thinking through a concept as well. So even though this was in a very different context, we discussed this, I want to nevertheless bring it in here as well. No problem, Nadia. Good to have you. So concepts, and for those who are still here, we won't probably be another 20 minutes, so we won't be the full 2 hours. No, that's okay. So when we think about concepts, if you have the concept in front of you, excellent, right? Or engagement, or whatever, or equity. That concept is always in relation to other concepts. It always has a relationship to something that it isn't, or something that it doesn't want to be, or it's a near synonym, or something. So this is just very broadly. So when we do conceptual engineering, concept creation, you always have to remember or see that concept in relation to these other things, right? What it isn't, what it tries to avoid, etc. And so a very good example from our own context, from Southern African thinking, is Black consciousness. Because what Steve Biko did was he took the word Black, which is a generic word, 99% of the world's language is the word Black, but which in South Africa, of course, took on a very particular meaning in relation to race, racialized thinking, racialized discourse. And what he did is he took a word that existed So that this is different from kind of creating a new word, taking an existing word, and finding a way to give it a new content. So what black under apartheid was not, the only thing it was not something. What it was not was white. So everything that was good was white, everything that was powerful was white, everything that was beneficial was white. So blackness, or the word black, was kind of just the emptiness of white. So what he said was the word black shouldn't be non-white. It's it is non-white, but it shouldn't be non-white. In other words, it shouldn't be a negative definition. So what blackness is therefore is something that has substance, which is the opposite of white, but which is not non-white. So you can see what he started doing with the word. He started thinking, okay, if whiteness is the power and non-white is the opposite of that, what can we have that can take some form of substance? So he offered blackness as having something substantive to it, which is not simply the absence of white. So this is a very simple thing in many ways, but also far-reaching. And so this way of thinking, of saying, okay, what do I have? What will be its opposite? And perhaps opposite already has meaning, right? In this case, opposite was only something without meaning, but if something has meaning, doesn't have meaning, how can I fill it with content? How can I give it some kind of depth, some kind of meaning that I can use that generative productively, where the other word has failed, like excellence. So the word excellence, we can now say, oh, in the NIF context, we've seen the word excellence. Something else. This word has failed us. The word is meaningless. It's confusing. It's jarring. It doesn't seem to have any real logic to it. So what other word can we use, or other word can we create that can then fill this seeming void in relation to excellence? Now, if we look at the strategy again, I'm not on the next page, that's all on excellence. But let's just go here to the preamble. Are there any words that jump out to you, perhaps in the text, or having thought now about excellence and its problem, that you might want to have another word for excellence? So if there's perhaps a word in that, or another word that you might think of, that can take the place of excellence, challenge excellence.
Please repeat again, Lauren.
So you read this, and you see we now know the word excellence is problematic in the way they use it. So are there any other words, either in this section, or that's come to mind that you would say that's a better value, that we can say we would, rather than, if we can rewrite the NIF document, we can rewrite the strategy. Rather than say our third value is the importance of excellence, rather than that, we want a different word, different value. What value can you think of that can challenge excellence, or word that can challenge excellence? Transformation. Okay, so you already have the word transformation. So then how would you define transformation in relation to excellence as a critique?
Well, in relation to excellence, I don't think that far, but
that's fine. You can think it through as you talk.
Well, in this case, I just thought that perhaps instead of speaking about more of excellent research, how about we, just remove the word excellent completely, but then, replace it with transformative research instead of excellent research. So that's how I understood the question.
Yes.
If you were to say that I must give another word to excellent, you probably need to give me 5 days to think about it.
But that's already a start. We just throw it out. So that's one.
Yeah.
So we just have 3 values, and we'd rather have transformation. Any other suggestions or ideas or impressions?
Yeah, I think I'm still on quality. Like for me, quality matters. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
If I read something and I find like the value in it, it's hard for me to, this is excellent.
Yes.
It's just the quality for me, it broadens my, my thinking and my intellectual capacities. And it's because I've just read a text that has quality value, not because I'm thinking, it's on top in the hierarchy of that particular discipline. No, I just think of how it provokes me and it provokes new ideas and new ways of seeing, other than thinking, oh, I need to put this article on top against, that idea of rating.
Yes.
You need to be number one. For me, it's the quality. When you take it to new worlds, new ways of seeing.
So I saw Michaela had, what's the word? Honorableness. What was the word?
Honorableness, yeah.
Did she write more than that? Just the word?
Just the word.
Just the word. Thank you, Michaela. That's a very interesting. I don't think I've ever thought of honorableness. So that's a very thought-provoking. So we actually now have two kinds of proposals. One is the kind of just removing it and kind of focusing on the rest that's there. That's one suggestion. Another suggestion would be replacing either quality or honorableness, Michaela mentioned. Yes.
I would replace with value.
With value.
Yeah.
Okay.
It being a value itself, but just replacing it with the word value, because I see value tying into impact, transformation, and sustainability. So the value there, so just having that word as a set of pieces.
I like that as well, value. Nice. Well, nothing stops us from having the three together, value, quality, and honorableness. But the point is, those are the type of thing that you can then think of in relation to where you write policy. Then be the question, okay, NRF and quality, NRF and value, NRF and honorableness, to fill in this kind of slot, right? So this is the extra step, the kind of policy writing would, if you do it in relation to a policy critique. If you write a piece of policy from scratch, it would be different, right? Because then you won't have something that you compare it with. It will just be, what's the idea? But if you're trying to improve a piece of policy or to suggest something in relation to a revised policy, then this is the type of thing you can do. To ask you to do this kind of analysis on these three levels, or something else if you do CDA, trying to understand how do these the existing policy reproduce, reaffirm, recenter existing power dynamics, and then thinking, okay, what else? Value or honorableness or quality, etc. So for the final bit, I'm going to give you a piece, and so now we 2, 2, 2 online and 1. I think you can join them. It will be a group of 3, a group of 2, and online. I don't know how to create groups, breakout rooms, but if we could have breakout rooms of 3, so 2, 2. Oh no, I'm on 1, so it will be 3, 2. Breakout. Do you see? Because there'll be one group of 2 and one group of 3. So if we're going to have a breakout group, I don't know how we can do that. Anyone know? Can we not?
We can.
Oh, this
Okay, but let's before we get there, you just go through the 3 questions again, right? From where and to where does the policy flow? That's the methodological question. Then there's the epistemological question. The meeting organizer. Thanks, Michaela. I don't know who the meeting organizer is. Are you okay? Good. Okay. And then the epistemological question, which are what are the constituent ideas or what's left unsaid? And then on the ontological sphere, you have what are the intended effects and linked to that possible unintended effects, right, of this policy. So those 3 questions, keep that together with the question of what is an alternative? If you're critical, what is the alternative? Right? Concept. The 4 things, in effect, 4 questions you have to answer. And you have to do it in relation to something that comes from us in our space, our engagement policy. So I've taken one section from the engagement policy, which is the definition of engagement. So what does NMU define as engagement? It's very nice to be critical of the NRF and the definition of excellence. What is our definition of engagement? And what are the power differentials that we reinforce, keep in place through that policy, implicitly or explicitly? So I've taken that, it's third section from this long, very long policy document, but I've just taken the NMU engagement policy definition of engagement, which is there. So you ask yourself in your groups 3 questions, right, in relation to the analysis of it, methodological, epistemological, ontological, and then proposing something else. And proposing something else might be very specific to on one of those points, or it might even say to do away with the word engagement as such. Perhaps there's a better word we can use, a whole different concept. Perhaps engagement is overrated. You say we should go back into the ivory tower. All of this engagement work is up to shit. We don't care about these people if you want to be radical. It could even be that. So anything you want, that's an alternative or critique. So now I want us to go into the breakout room. So for perhaps help. Oh, there are rooms. There are these rooms.
Oh, yeah.
Breakout rooms. Automatically assigned. Okay. Automatic. Okay. Oh, and what it's 25 past 2. Let's do 35 past, so 10 minutes. Okay, for in our groups to read through and then create something else. Okay. Okay, colleagues. Could I ask just general response, just to what this felt like? Was this something that you have done? Perhaps you felt similar to other things you might have analyzed, or did this feel completely new as an exercise? Was it new or felt like you?
Yeah, it was new to think of it like this. And I think it opened up like broad discussions, even beyond just going like one.
Yes.
It was like a conversation starter, but obviously still in relation to like the full convocation students. But it was new for me
Okay.
to study policy like that,
Okay.
rather than just reading it as a document.
But it's not necessarily new for me. I think I do this almost like concept. Yeah, it was super interesting, and I kept on saying to her, "Oh my goodness, when am I going to start?" Because my mind is just running, and I'm not getting to the paper. So it's just something that we do on a daily, and super interesting.
It's not really new for me. It's something that we always do within the engagement of space. But it's also like engaging with the policy itself and questioning what you see without just taking it face value as it is. So it's always exciting and always interesting to analyzing things as well.
Oh, and there's one thing I noticed. I just said to her, like, look at how amazing this looks. It's not perfectly when you read it. But then when you actually interrogate what you are reading, that's where it actually, that's where it collapses. Yeah, otherwise it looks like an amazing read.
Yeah.
Anyone online, perhaps from the online group? Any comments, or just in broad strokes? Can be very specific, but also can be very broad comments. Doesn't have to be. Yes, Sonia.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, our group was able to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the first kind of item that we needed to discuss. And what that highlighted for me is just what a time-consuming process this kind of analysis is, because you start picking up on an idea, and you can really go to town sometimes with those ideas, and end up spending a good 2 hours, analyzing a sentence and losing track. So for me, what was helpful was actually having those 4 questions as a guide, because of that process, that you can really get lost in the process of analysis, and sometimes go down really interesting, but for the purpose of what you are doing, somewhat irrelevant or not really useful paths, if that makes sense.
That's so true, Sonia, and I think that's why there are these kinds of approaches, or just using CDA as such. Because I mean, you can look at a policy document and be critical off the bat, but that's the problem. Is if you just start critiquing and gutting it and pulling it to shreds, You can end up doing that for hours or years on end. So yeah, having some kind of structure, having some kind of that, even if it's only for your own mind to get a structure is a good thing. So thanks for that, Sonia. Would anyone like to share one? Oh, Michaela. Sorry, Michaela.
Hi. There's something that we also initially got stuck up on was like the first part of the methodological question was, where does it come from? We kind of got stuck on that, like knowing, because we are insiders of Nelson Mandela, we know the history and context of the university. So it was interesting for us, where does this policy exactly come from? Is it an old policy that's just been reviewed and updated, and is it perhaps, reading it again with these eyes, it appears to be sort of like haunted by previous iterations of the university. You can see, it's the last point, there's a mutual planning, implementation and assessment among partners, which includes external stakeholders, students, staff and university, So you can see the, external stakeholders and students and staff, they're responding to things that have happened. Fees must fall, students need a voice now. We're now a merged university. We need to, not only assess, but implement and plan with other people. So that was something interesting for us. And yeah, it's funny how this sort of discourse analysis became that discussion.
But that's also what happens when you're in a group. I think the moment you're on your own and you're doing this, then you'll be kind of probably have blinkers on because you'll focus on the questions that you have at hand. There'll be things that pop up, you get ideas, but you won't have this conversation. And I think that's where the questions are even more beneficial if you're on a group. Because in your own work, you'll mostly be focused on your own ideas and that will guide your analysis. But when you're in a group, there are so many things, possible avenues. You have some kind of structure. Okay, this is what we're looking for. This is the planes upon the analysis. It can at least keep the conversation. And even then, there's a lot more to say. So that's even difficult. But just to have some structure, which is something that we all do. None of us here will do most probably do policy analysis on our own. We'll do it in the context of ETP or CriSHET or whatever. And so having these kinds of structures is just beneficial just in terms of time, keeping focused. What I'm really interested, okay, well, that was general. Was there anything that popped out for you that you didn't think of, perhaps, that was very new about engagement? I mean, Michaela just mentioned something excellent about where it comes from, but anything else that might have popped out for you on the policy and that you hadn't thought about that? Or alternatively, I would also like to know what if you offered something else, what that something else was. If you would like to change something or add something, what, if you got there. Yeah,
I think we spent a lot of time on the ontological.
Yes.
And I think we had 2 points where when we were reading through this excerpt is that it sounds like as an institution we're taking a stance and we deliberately use the word appear as a very engaging institution. Okay. And then Jonathan also raised the point around that maybe we could be reacting to the name because we carry a name of a very honorable man. Yeah. So obviously we want those conversations to be an ongoing thing within the institution. And then we had another discussion around measuring the impacts of these engagements and also how do we not become redundant? How do we not sound the same? How are we going to ensure that we don't sound the same? And then we raised a point around maybe being very intentional. And then we also spoke about monitoring and evaluation. With these engagements, we felt like this excerpt doesn't address the idea of feedback. How do we know that if we had a workshop or an engagement, it had an impact to people who care? So we thought about that, measuring the impact of these engagements and also creating feedback processes And then the last point that we also spoke about was since we carry such a big name, how do we ensure that autonomy and academic freedom still exists within these engagements? How do we not like fall in the trap of institutional scholarship versus our own individual scholarship? Like, how do you attend a conference and still sound like a literary scholar if you're a literary scholar, not a literary scholar at Nelson Mandela University? Yeah, so balancing that, the institutional politics and also our own academic freedom as scholars. Yeah, like what's the threshold? How do you balance?
Yeah.
Because it's very important to be conscious of the space you exist within,
Yes.
but also your autonomy as a scholar, because at the end of the day, you are a thinker. Yeah, so we had those discussions.
I like that. Yeah, that was something I didn't think of at all. That's fascinating. Not that I think of everything, but that's just something new for me that you've mentioned. Michaela. Where's it? The chat. Sorry, can somebody just read what Michaela?
For me, it was interesting to see that engagement for the university is seen as knowledge sharing. I've never thought of engagement in terms of knowledge before. It makes sense, but it feels a little clinical.
Yeah, Michael, that's an important point. I think sometimes the way in which we use certain words, I'm assuming that by knowledge, they would have a very expansive, for some people would have a very expansive idea, as in lived knowledge and memory and practical knowledge or whatever. But because we have the word in a clinical sense in the academy, by knowledge we mean something specific. It doesn't translate as well, perhaps, on the ear, the way the policy sound. But that's an important point. Thanks, Michel. Interesting point. Any other last impressions or views?
Jonathan said the word enhance is superficial.
Enhance is superficial. Okay. Why do you say it's superficial?
I don't have like a very comprehensive explanation before, but it just feels like enhanced social. I don't know, I'd probably change the word, because when I think about enhanced, I think about artificial intelligence and enhancing something. Like an image or something, just enhancing it, just like, yeah. Maybe I should do a deeper study into the word enhance. I don't know.
Can I please ask a question? Is it because you've seen that a lot in the spaces that you've been, particularly in university spaces?
Yeah.
Like enhancing something as a word itself? That's super interesting.
Yeah, but can also add that he was speaking in relation to enhance social, economic, and ecological sustainability. So he said in that context,
it felt
like superficial. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It is the university's favorite word. Bonds.
Well, thanks for that. Any last comments or ideas, reflections, takeaways, comments, anything? Because if not so, then we've reached the end of our seminar. Which is longer than I thought. I thought we'd be done about a half an hour ago, so we filled up the time. There's more we took time with the discussions and grateful for. So, colleagues, thank you again for your time and your energy and your willingness. And like I said, CDA is a very broad term. So that's both. Yes.
Sorry,
Michaela?
that was just me. I didn't realize my mic was on. Sorry.
Okay. Both the beauty and the potential downfall of CDA is that it is such a broad thing. But its beauty, but if you look at it more, focusing on the beauty of it, is that you can mold and shape your methodology in relation to particular questions. But as long as you remember that for it to be CDA, to be critical, it has to have that underlying question of power always underpinning it. You can never do away with that. Then it's no longer CDA, then it's just discourse analysis, which is fine. That's a whole field unto itself. but in relation to the type of work we do in CriSHET and ETP in the broad ETP space. That is an important question and factor to always factor in. Question of power. Yeah, thank you so much, colleagues, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you for online.
Thanks everyone online. Thank you. Bye.